Hello, everyone. So glad you could join us today. It is 12 o'clock, and so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm sure there's going to be a few more people that will be logging on, but I'll just go ahead and start with our get us rolling. Thank you for joining us today. This is my name is Heather Frederick. I'm with the Center for Arkansas Farms and Food. We have partnered with Ryan Neal and Colin Massey with Benton and Washington County Extension offices to host a series of webinars this fall. Last month we had our tomato virtual demonstration, and today we are going to be talking about vegetable equipment considerations with Nathan Boone. I'm going to pass it over to Ryan here, but just before I do that, I wanted to let you guys know or kind of set some kind of guidelines for asking questions. We want this to be an interactive meeting. This is not on the webinar style, so we can see your faces. So I just wanted to let you know that. If you have questions, you're on mute right now. You can raise your hand. You can use the chat box. We'll be keeping an eye on the chat box. And so, we can have you unmute yourself and to make this as interactive as possible. I'll pass it over to Ryan and he can introduce Nathan for us.
Thank you, and thank you, Heather, and I appreciate Nathan being with us today. We had originally planned on Nathan being here for an in-person meeting and maybe multi-day some sort of training. And anyway, we've kind of pivoted to being online, which I think will be beneficial because we'll be able to record this and also have it on our YouTube channel. And so I'll tell a little bit about Nathan. He grew up farming with his father, uncle, and grandfather on a conventional grain and livestock operation in Boone County, Indiana. After graduating from Depew University with a degree in geology, he migrated west to explore organic farm production. In 1998, he was hired by Seeds of Change to manage their 7-acre certified organic research farm in northern New Mexico. Shortly after, Nathan moved to Sonoma County, California to manage Oak Hill Farm, a well-established 40-acre organic operation specializing in produce, ornamentals, and field-grown flowers. After managing these farms, Nathan launched his own operation, First Light Farm, in Sebastopol, California. Within 5 years, First Light Farm grew into a dynamic 20-acre operation marketing through a CSA program, farm stand, 5-acre farmers market, a pumpkin patch, restaurant accounts, and wholesale distribution to 6 Whole Foods Market stores in the San Francisco area. In 2015, Nathan sold First Light Farm and moved back to Indiana to take over the family farm. Boone Family Farm is a 200-acre with 70 acres currently in transition to organic certification. In 2016, Nathan purchased an Oxbow Pixall 1-row green bean picker to produce green beans on 22 acres of transitional ground for a contract he negotiated with a processor. In 2018 will be the first certified organic production. In the meantime, the farm will produce transitional green beans on contract, alfalfa orchard, grass, hay, and grain. I'm sure Nathan can also give us some updates on where he's at with that. But without further ado, I'll turn it over to Nathan and let him tell us more about himself.
Nathan, I'm going to stop sharing my slides, so you should be able to get yours, and I'm going to pin. And just one more quick note as Nathan's getting his slides up. You can, I just wanted to remind you all that you can change the view of how you're viewing the slides and the speaker with the in the upper right-hand corner of your box. There should be some settings for viewing. All right, Nathan, you're on mute yet, so.
Good morning. Unmuting is the first consideration. Good morning to Arkansas. Thank you everyone for having me, for inviting me. I was hoping to be there in person, and I think I will be doing some farm visits coming up shortly, which Ryan is coordinating. I want to thank Ryan for inviting me, for the University of Arkansas Extension and the Center for Arkansas Farms and Food for just kind of hosting this and holding the container and making it possible. And the guys have been really great to help me get this organized and get this presentation together. So thank you very, very much. I wanted to start out with just some storytelling in the beginning to kind of warm us up. And I really do encourage everyone that's here online to think of this as a dialogue and a conversation, because I'm a grower. Many of you are hopefully growers as well. And we learn best through each other and from each other. And I certainly, all the things that I've learned have been from other people. So I really encourage you to raise your hands or do whatever it is to get Heather's attention so we can hear from you, inshallah. Okay, so I am going to present to my next slide. And for some reason, I'm not able to click it forward. So let me see if I can move forward here. Nope, this is not what I want to do.
Of course.
Yeah, there we go. It just took a little bit of time. So I wanted to tell the story of how I got here and my learning path, because all of us have some kind of a path that has led us into, or we continue to be in agriculture. And so my learning path went through many iterations. And as Ryan mentioned, I did grow up on a conventional grain farm in central Indiana, very typical kind of operation, multi-generational. And I had no interest I really didn't like gardening at all when I was a kid, because it was just work. I mean, mom would say, go pick green beans, and that was like the worst thing ever. And then here I am in a green bean operation later in life. But at any rate, my journey back to produce became a personal interest in growing my own food. And that kind of culminated in landing a farm management position at Seeds of Change in northern New Mexico, which was kind of a dream job. And managing other people's farms is one way to learn very rapidly, because a lot of times you're stepping into an existing farming operation, and you kind of just get to play with a full set of toys and see how they do it. You get to see the good, the bad, and the ugly. And Seeds of Change certainly introduced me to an operational 7-acre seed trial farm, and we grew all kinds of variety. It was just outrageous. I mean, the kind of stuff that they were growing there I'd never seen before. And that definitely just kind of fueled my interest in growing healthy food, diverse food, and lots of different specialty crops. I farmed there for 2 seasons, and then I got an opportunity to work at Oak Hill Farm through a friend. That was a connection in Sonoma County, and Sonoma County became a home for about 15 years for me. So the next step was to go manage that farm, and that had been around since the 50s, really, and had a full farm working crew. They had vegetables, they had flowers, they had ornamentals, everything was there in place. And that was a whole nother scale. They had flower markets in San Francisco. I mean, it was a really, really dynamic operation. And I was playing a small part actually just in the produce, but also all overall farm management. But that introduced me to flowers, which I'll come back to in a little bit. And then after managing people's farms, and if you have any experience in working for someone else or for managing a farm, you get to the point to where you feel like you're ready to do it for yourself. Part of that is that you're kind of limited when you're managing someone else's farm, because it's their farm and you can't always do what you want. And you may not always see eye to eye with how they're doing things or their considerations. So after I worked for Oak Hill Farm, I actually took a 5-year sabbatical off of farming, because I've been farming intensively for about 4 to 5 years. And I kind of felt like I hit a wall with managing other people's farms. It didn't feel like that's the next step I needed to take, was manage yet another farm. So I took some time off, and I was the land steward at the Sonoma Land Trust. And that was fabulous, because I got to stay in the Sonoma County, and I was managing large properties rather than individual farms. But I still came back to that passion. I still found that I really, really wanted to be a grower. And so that's why in 2007, I launched First Light Farm. And I picked this picture of this kale crop because a lot of our farm was based on this, really good crop for us. And there's reasons for that. One, this is a coastal farm. It was very productive. I had a silt soil. silt loam that you just could not, you could not do anything wrong with the soil. It would always produce. There's no downside to a silt loam. And because it was coastal and because it was fertile soil and because I had a goat dairy nearby that we made tons of compost from, I had all kinds of fertility. And that farm became a signature kale farm. But anyway, I wanted to walk you through how I jumped from managing other people's farms to my own farm in '07. And then we're going to get into equipment considerations as to how equipment plays a role in one's ability to grow and diversify a farm operation, hopefully. So the advantage of working for someone else and managing other people's farms is you get to take all the learning that you can from them and all the different operations and systems and equipment and just how they do things. It's all systems. So everything that I had learned, that turned into about a 20-acre, 25-acre year-round vegetable operation, all kinds of markets. When you grow that much vegetables, you have to sell them. And so really your marketing becomes a huge driver for you. And we were at that time about 50% direct sales, retail through CSA, farmers markets, restaurants, chefs, you name it. And then about 50% wholesale to natural food stores. So that's kind of the 50-50 was kind of how we did it. But there was a lot that led up to this. And I wanted to kind of remind everyone, especially for the beginning farmers or the farmers that are just kind of getting going, is that, really you can't just look at the pictures and realize that a lot of work went into all of these things. So it looks like talent is often careful preparation. And this quote also says, what looks like skill is often persistent revision. So we're always, as farmers, we're always tinkering with things, right? Like we're always trying to figure things out. And so every week and every month and every season and every winter, we're kind of recalibrating, and that's kind of how it works out. But it's good to have some goalposts in mind. So here's some of the ways that I set this up because I was doing a panel on scaling up, and this is kind of a real linear progression of like how I started, what scale I was at, how I did different things and why. So I wanted to kind of walk everyone through this. So in '07, I started with about 2 acres. I found a landowner that was a cooperative and wanted to work with me and gave me access to the land and a lease and a place to live, actually, and even let me use his tractor. So that was a great low cost way to get started farming. And I started with farmers markets because that's really the fastest way to get into selling, is enter into a farmers market and also to restaurant sales. So that's where I started. But I also started building my CSA at the same time, because going to farmers markets, you're meeting people, you're talking it up, you're building your CSA simultaneously to that. So I did that for about a year. I got the CSA membership up to about 100. And remember, this was during the Great Recession. So this was like '07, '08. And so it wasn't an easy thing to do, but the region of the country that I was in, Northern California, local food was becoming more and more of a thing. And so people were very responsive, and the CSA model at that time was still very attractive, and it was relatively easy to sell the CSA shares and keep that going. And then in '09, I took over a 10-acre potato farm. That was just an opportunity that kind of fell in my lap through a friend. And it was an existing operation. It had a great reputation. It was a dry farm potato operation, which I didn't know anything about. I didn't know anything about growing that much potatoes, but I just kind of stepped into it. And the existing owners kind of coached me and introduced me to their markets. And that's where it kind of took off. The potatoes then led me into getting into additional farmers markets, because a lot of our farmers markets are full out here. I don't know what they're like down where you're at, but it's actually very hard to get into farmers markets. You get on a waiting list, and it's really not even that easy, because if the market managers are really trying to balance the kinds and the types of produce and products that are in the market. So if you don't have the right product mix, you're not going to get in. I mean, if you just have tomatoes and corn and melons, everybody's got that, and you're not going to get in. So the potato farm gave me an opportunity to get into the markets. And this highlights a concept that I want to share with you. And this equipment conversation is going to be as much about concepts and ideas and approaches and philosophies is that it's going to be about me telling you what equipment works, because you guys know what equipment is out there. There's more information than ever on the internet and every which way, and from extension, and there's so many resources now. But the question is, how do you decide? How do you know? And one of the concepts I want to encourage and emphasize this morning is stepping into the river of life. And when you choose to grow, when you choose to expand, when you choose to go in a particular direction, you're stepping into that river of life, which then carries you to a new place that you weren't before, and you don't know where it's going to lead, and you don't know where it's going to take you, but you're affirmatively stepping into it. And so this 10-acre potato farm is a really great example. It kind of landed in my lap. I didn't really know what I was getting into, but it was awfully hard to say no to, because it was a great opportunity. And it actually translated into a massive market expansion, because using the potato reputation of this particular farm, I was instantly able to get into farmers markets that I never could have gotten into if I just showed up and said, hey, I have veggies. They were like, oh, you're the old Tommy Boy potato guy. And I'm like, yeah, I'm that guy. And so they're like, okay, come Saturday. So that opened it up. So I had access to this 10-acre farm in coastal California with this gorgeous silt loam and kind of a cooler, more moist climate. And I started trialing a bunch of different things, because I knew this place could grow, and I just didn't know exactly what. And one of the things that I trialed was kale. And I honestly direct seeded um, kale and just walked away from it. I didn't even have time to deal with it. I just direct seeded a bunch of different crops, including kale. And then I came back like midsummer, and the kale was already like practically waist high. And it was the most beautiful kale I ever saw. So that led me to the next step. So I moved on. And so we're all the way to 2011. I had grown, I was at the 10-acre scale, and I was starting to diversify into other crops. And I knew that I needed more help. And there's a difference between farm worker help, which is the people that are working in your field and helping you, and people that are helping you manage and doing high level, either tillage or cultivation or, running deliveries or what have you. So I needed someone kind of a right-hand person to be able to help me. So I brought on a farming partner. And at that same time, I landed with this kale, amazing kale that I landed a contract for 100 cases of kale per week from a kale chip manufacturer that was fairly close. And I thought that that was the greatest thing ever. And it was. 100 cases per week is a good deal. And it was a great price. And everything was lined up. And I kind of had one season of kale at this farm, and I thought I could do it. And I did it. The very first delivery, I got a call back a couple days later, and they said, we cannot use your kale. And I said, why not? And they said, it's so sweet and so soft and so tender because of my coastal setting that it did not dehydrate well, and it didn't make good chips. So here I was with 100 cases of kale per week in the field, and the main buyer that I had couldn't buy it. So this is a tale too of stepping into the river of life, but also where a tragedy leads to opportunity. So with all of that kale needing to be sold, I developed additional markets to other regional buyers, because I had a ton of kale in my mind. And I started reaching out to all the different stores and distributors, and I found that they were starting to pick me up. And so that led to more increase. And then in 2012, my partner and I found another farm that was just coming up. This was a retiring farmer. And we also took that one over, including his equipment, and everything started to gel at that point. And at that point, we had grown to the scale where we had all the farmers markets, we had all the wholesale, and now we were just really kind of like dialing it in and really trying to perfect our production systems and get our yields up and our quality up and just make everything click. So we also started our CSA back up in 2012. And then that went all the way until 2014. In 2014, for personal reasons, my daughter graduated high school, for example, and went off to college, and my parents were getting older, and I wanted to move back to the farm So I sold my farming operation, the business, not the land, because we rented everything, but I sold the farming business to my partner, and I moved back to Indiana in 15. So that kind of capped the whole 7-year expansion process of farming. And when I came back to Indiana, it's completely different. There's not a local food movement at all. I couldn't find no interest in diverse, any kind of produce in the local markets. And I didn't want to repeat the farmers markets experience because they're not as vibrant there. And you just can't. I had a lot of land to play with and I needed larger markets. So I found a food bank actually that had a processing facility that wanted to buy green beans. And I made a contract with them. I found the green bean picker, and ironically, I came to Arkansas first to look at a green bean picker, actually really close to where Ryan is, I think, out there in Northwest Arkansas. But anyway, I bought a green bean picker, and I started that operation. And the rest of the farm, as Ryan said, is in kind of transition to organics. And we've been doing organic grains on smaller parcels. We did field corn. We've done tofu soybeans. This year we did popcorn, and that worked out pretty good. So we're just kind of playing around. But anyway, that's all of my background in produce and playing around with all the different equipment. So let's jump into to kind of getting into the heart of this conversation. So this quote is from a physicist that said, "An expert is a person who has found out by painful experience all the mistakes that one can make in a very narrow field." So I'm not an expert, but I certainly have gone through a lot of painful experiences, and some are mistakes and some are just the curveballs that you find in life. So I want to talk about pitfalls to consider when you're thinking about how to make your operation better. And I'll just pause right here and ask Heather if anybody is raising their hands or asking any questions. Heather, I think you're muted.
I don't see any questions out there, but does anybody have any questions at this point? You can feel free to raise your hand or type something in the chat box.
Okay, no problem. So I kind of thought about, when I read this slide, I was just kind of like, what are all the things that I did? And now this is from my perspective. There's certainly many more pitfalls to consider, but these are the ones that kind of jumped out to me, the things that if I could do it all over again, or if I could talk to a younger person or someone that's just starting out, what are some of the things to consider? And one of the things that I did a lot of was doing without, like substituting grit and sweat to make it work. And certainly that's always necessary if you're in any kind of small business, and if you're a small farmer or a farmer in general. Doing without, you kind of have to do without. Like, I don't know anybody that can just buy the perfect factory and just start running it. That's not how farmers typically do it. But there's a fine balance between understanding what you need to be successful and then actually not doing it. Like just doing something slightly less than, which is guaranteeing you that you're going to be less successful. So when you're younger, and for me, for sure, I had a lot more energy and a lot more ambition, and I could work longer and harder, I would do that. But looking back, I sure wish that I would have just stopped to do a little bit more planning, to do a little bit more projecting and calculating and number crunching, and understanding, like, yeah, the sooner I get this particular piece of equipment, the sooner I can be producing at the scale or at the level that I want to, and making my operation click better. Because I think for me, like, I've evolved to the point where I look at things now more as a system and as an organization and as an entity, rather than just diving into one thing at a time. So that's one thing. Skimping on important aspects to save money. You certainly have to save money, but it doesn't make sense to save money on things that are costing you, right? So like, if you do need something, you need to figure out a way to make that happen, because the sooner you make that happen, the sooner everything's going to be working the way you need it to. And hopefully that's tied to you being economically viable. Not selecting the equipment that can work longer term. This is another common thing that happened for me and other growers that I know, is that you just get what can get you by that season. Or in my case, I went through this evolution of transplanters. So, first we transplanted everything by hand because we were at like a 2-acre scale, and that works fine. But that means you're limited to doing everything by hand. So your weeding is done by hand, and no matter how straight you try to make your rows, it's pretty hard to do mechanical cultivation or tractor cultivation. And then you do transplanting. And the first transplanter I got was a 1-row transplanter. And so that worked great. We just thought that was the greatest thing ever. And then I got the kale contract, and I needed to plant about 1 acre of kale at a time. And the 1-row, you can only make 2 rows on a bed if you offset your 1 row and then drive down the bed and turn around and drive back the other way. That way you get 2 rows. Well, you can never get them straight. So we had saved time by having a transplanter, but we didn't have a 2-row transplanter. So that meant that our rows were a little squirrely, and we couldn't really use mechanical cultivation that well. And every once in a while we'd knock plants out. And then we graduated eventually to our higher speed 2-row mechanical transplanter. And then that kind of like sustained us and was the real ticket that kept the farm going for the duration of the farm. So, looking back, I sure wish I would have just bought the 2-row, not struggled with the 1-row at all. But I didn't know that at the time, but I'm telling you guys now. So now you know that. So just don't think that if you step up every single time you do that, that means you're going to be buying a lot of things and then getting back out of them. And with smaller equipment, as you may know, it doesn't always hold its value as well as larger equipment. So burning through a bunch of small equipment means that your boneyard turns into kind of like a museum of old stuff that you don't want to use anymore. The other thing is buying old things that break down all the time. We all know about that one. I mean, there's a lot of cheap stuff on Craigslist and Facebook. And sometimes if you have time to fix all that, or if you like to fix stuff, that's cool. But bottom line is when it's go time and it's spring and you're planting and you're harvesting and you're doing all that stuff, you don't want anything to break down at that time. Everything that's broken, you want to fix it late spring or early or late winter. Make sure everything's working. So I know one farmer in particular, he's actually my best friend, and I don't know why it is that this farm family, they're always breaking down. And it's not because they buy old things necessarily, but for some reason that farm is always breaking down, and they're always, you always see a tractor sitting in the field and there's some pickup truck next to it, and they're always jumping this tractor and doing that. And that's a real drag. I like to have everything working and going as much as possible. So that can really slow you down. Also buying too many things, in specialty production, there's all kinds of equipment. There's a lot more now than ever. And you can certainly buy lots of bells and whistles and pieces and things that can help you. And, it depends on what your finances are. If you can afford those things and you can cash flow them and you've got the savings and it's important to you, that's not a problem. But if you're on a budget, you kind of have to be a little bit more specific and a little bit more focused. Also thinking about, one of the things that I did early on was thinking about buying equipment as an expense, when really your equipment is a capital asset with a much longer lifespan. So, if you think about that piece of equipment, it might be $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000. You're like, wow, I can't afford that. That's a lot of money up front. But really, a piece of equipment is a capital asset that doesn't really lose its value that much. I mean, it does depreciate, and you might not get as much for it as when you paid for it, but it really should last. And you've got to give yourself the ability to cost that out over its lifespan of its use. So if you're going to use something for 10 years, 15 years, even 5 years, it doesn't really cost the $5,000 the first year. I mean, you have to come up with the $5,000, but it doesn't cost your operation that much each year. So for me, that's one of the things that probably prevented me from just investing and figuring out ways to invest that would give me the equipment and the wherewithal to get down the road and get done what I needed to do. And that gets me to these last 2 points. So avoiding planning and then making a commitment to find capital, because sometimes we just jump to our conclusions like, I can't afford that, or that's not for me, or maybe I'll do that next year. And instead of just planning it out and really looking at your operations, say, you know what, I really do need to upgrade my irrigation system, or I really do need to make this happen, or I really need to build this walk-in cooler, but I don't have the money. How can I find the money? So find your solution first, and then figure out how to finance it. But if you don't, if you always just make the excuse, I don't have the money for it, you're not going to do it. And that's just the way it works for me anyway. And then avoiding financing and therefore a more sustainable cash flow for your operation. So, I like to pay for things if I have the money. And one of the downfalls of that is that it's hard to cash flow your operation if you have to buy a bunch of equipment all at once. And when we took on our 16-acre farm, we actually took on about a $90,000 loan. We bought all the equipment from the retiring farmer, and he self-financed about 40 grand of that. And we had to come up with 50 grand. And we actually crowdfunded for about half of that 50 grand. So about 25 grand we got in a crowdfunding. And then the other half, we found a private investor. That was a good way to spread all that out. But the mistake that we made is that we had a 3-year payback. And I don't know why we did 3-year payback, because at the time it seemed like the way to do it, but it wasn't, because that big of a loan needed a way longer payback time, because it really, we were able to pull it off, but it was very difficult and it put a lot of stress on the farm. So when you avoid financing, it really puts a cash flow crunch on your farm. So figure out what you need and try to find a long window, a long runway, so you can cash flow the equipment over a longer period of time. So that's my suggestion on that. And this is kind of a story that I wanted to share with you. It's very similar to my transplanter story, actually. So this is a great little operation out east. Jean-Paul is well known. He's written some books and he's on the speaking circuit and all that. And he's really a big advocate of this too, of like, thinking about your ideal equipment system, thinking about how all the pieces fit together, right? So, and he says you really have to plan before you spend a nickel. And every time you purchase equipment, it narrows your options for future purchases. So he talks about how for years they did a water wheel transplanter. And Ryan tells me a lot of people have the water wheel transplanters in your area, and they work, and they actually work pretty good, and they work good through plastic mulch and all that. But for Jean-Paul, he found that they weren't very well designed for what he needed for day-long transplanting days, and he just couldn't get it. They weren't very fast. They're kind of slow. So they bought a high-speed carousel planter, and they increased their efficiency, and that's kind of where he needed to be. So again, this goes back to being realistic about the scale that you want to be at, and kind of landing on the size or the solution that's going to fit you for a little while. You don't want to outgrow of your clothes the day after you buy them. You kind of want to grow into them and then have a little bit of room for expansion and for some change as you go along. Just going to take a quick drink of water, excuse me. Okay, so before we get in, we haven't talked hardly anything about equipment, but I'm going to talk about farm scaling up issues, and this being kind of the backdrop and the foundation for when you think about equipment and how to think about it. So when you think about scaling up, and I always put this first, and you'll find that when you read about farm planning, that the very first thing that they talk about is your goals. Like, what are your goals? Because everything is relative to you. What is it that you want? What is it that you're trying to do? What's important to you? And I remember, I'll tell you a little story. When I was farming in California, our farm was selected to receive farm financial planning technical assistance from a new nonprofit. And these were like people with finance backgrounds, and they had worked for banks, and they were like business planners, and they were really super smart. And we sat down for our very first meeting with our advisor, and he was going to be our advisor for the next 2 years. And so we had no idea what to expect. We were farmers. And so we sit down at our kitchen table with him. And the very first thing is he looked at both me and my farming partner. He said, "Well, what do you guys want to do?" And we both looked at each other and laughed, and we're like, Well, we thought you were going to tell us, because you really have to decide yourself what it is that you're doing and why, and what's your personal intention. So what's important to you and why is very, very important. Don't overlook that. And then you start with an accurate assessment of your operation, and I put both feeling and finances here. So how does your life feel in this particular setting? And what are your finances telling you about how you can fund and continue and maybe make a go of this? So, and then your current and your potential markets. So your current markets are whatever they are, and then your potential markets are kind of pointing you to where you can grow, because you can't grow beyond your markets, obviously. And for me, the market development always preceded the production expansion. So we never produced anything if we didn't have a market for it. And we certainly grew things anticipating that our current markets could absorb them, but we never ever planted without knowing which channel we would go with that particular crop. And then this next piece is really about your personal orientation and capacity for change, because when when you're at a smaller scale, you have kind of the flexibility to be your own boss, of course, and you're kind of just doing your own thing, your own personal way, and that's really important at that scale. But when you start to get larger scale, you're all of a sudden now you're more of like an orchestrator or a conductor of a much larger, more chaotic symphony. So whereas before you're just jamming by yourself and just in your garage and you're having a great time, but all of a sudden now you've got more farm workers, you've got more customers, you've got more days that are this and that is happening. You have to be able to orchestrate that and develop higher level systems, and also managing more relationships. So all of these things mean that you have to increase your capacity in all of these things. And can you do that, or can you learn to do that, or are you kind of already cool with that? But that's a big thing, because some growers, even the growers that I hobnobbed with and rubbed elbows in the markets with, you could see some growers were kind of like, well, this is all I'm going to do. Like, I'm not interested in anything else. I'm going to grow apples and that's it. And other people were just like really creative and dynamic and just trying all kinds of things. And, there's no good or bad or right or wrong. It's just, scaling up requires increasing your capacity for change. And then when you talk about or think about scaling up, it's important to understand the need. Are you looking for more income? Do you want to do it full time, or is it already full time and you want to make more money? Do you have land? Like I have the blessing and also the curse of having a lot of land. I have 200 acres. I can't just do one thing. I mean, I have to figure out how to use all the land. Or maybe you just have an opportunity. Maybe there's a market that's literally knocking on your door that's asking you, hey, could you grow this for me? And I've had that situation. I mean, the kale, but also we grew cabbage for sauerkraut, and that was by far my funnest contract ever, because growing cabbage, I don't know, it just turned out to be really, really fun. Our biggest head was 21 pounds, and there's something really satisfying about growing a 20-pound head of cabbage and selling it on contract. So just define your need, understanding what it is, why are you scaling up, and what is really driving it, and what is your relationship to that driver? Is that all in alignment for you? I'm not going to talk about the SWOT analysis a lot in this presentation. It came up in another presentation, but a SWOT analysis is very helpful. You can look it up, but I will tell you very quickly, it's the strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And it helps you to kind of step out of your box, because a lot of times as growers, we don't always manage our farms or think about our farms as a business. It's just kind of like us doing it, right? And we were very highly attached with the farm. So the farm's success is really about our success. And if the farm fails, then we fail. And really, these other ways of looking at your business come from other industries and other business worlds, and they're very, very helpful. So the SWOT analysis is an opportunity for you to kind of get out of your personal attachment to your operation and really look at it objectively and say, okay, what are the strengths of my operation? What are the weaknesses? And what are the opportunities and what are the threats? Okay, so as a grower, you are probably more biased towards optimism and to possibilities and to things being possible, because that's why you're a grower. You wouldn't be a grower if you didn't have those strong qualities. So for me and for the people that I've done this with, the hard parts are the weaknesses and the threats. They tend to rely heavily on their strengths and ignore their weaknesses, and they look really strongly at their opportunities and orient around those, and they discount the threats. So when you do this analysis, it's kind of a brain dump or a brainstorm. You just kind of list them all, and then it helps you to kind of understand, opens up so that you don't have as many blind spots when you're kind of thinking about your operation. That's a whole presentation. That's a whole webinar all by itself, but I just wanted to throw it in there. And then crunch your numbers, because more activity doesn't always mean more profit. So that's one of the things that I've learned. You can get really, really busy in farming and not really walk away with any more money in your pocket. So be careful of that. Okay, and the same theme of scaling up, staying the same, or going down. When I found this chart, I thought it was really amazing because I'd never seen this chart before. And my farm actually kind of went through it. And when I realized this, I felt like it was helpful. So I wanted to share it with you. So at the very far left, I don't know if you can see my pointer here. When you're a startup and you're in an initial phase where, you really are in your first five years for sure, and maybe even more than that, you're an opportunistic and you're responding to opportunities and you're kind of doing a lot of things and trying a lot of things and kind of figuring out what works. At the same time you're doing all that, you're also figuring out what are the strong drivers of your finances, like where are the profit centers and what's really working. So you get to a place where you figure that out and it starts to level off, and where you're established, like your crops are established, your crop mix, your brand, your markets, your customer base. And then from there, you go through another phase where you either kick off and you grow more, or you either sustain that, or you actually decline. I mean, those are the kind of the three options there, right? So I just found this helpful in organizing, and sometimes it's nice to know where you're at in the cosmos. And so if you see yourself somewhere in this chart, it can be interesting information, and this is uniformly, it happens to all entities and all businesses, and so I thought it was very useful for farms as well. Okay, moving on. Where's the profit? So I'm doing all this stuff before we get to the equipment, because I feel like thinking about your equipment is part of this thing of overall, like how to make the farm successful. And of course you define success in your own way. And that's why it's important to know your intentions and your values and your goals for your farm. But certainly the profit is the cash flow that's making the systems work and underpinning it. So when I thought about where's the profit, I started with a list of where's the real areas to focus on. And one of the first, because this is an equipment presentation, we're talking about increasing efficiencies to reduce expenses and labor. And of course, this is class book, textbook 101, any ag land grant university you go to, and conventional ag is all about reducing expenses, because there's not a lot of control in any other aspects. Now we, in specialty production and produce and higher value, there's a little bit more wiggle room, and we get a little bit more creative than the standard commodity crop guys do. But your increasing efficiencies really have to do with your equipment selection, your infrastructure, meaning like just where is stuff, like where's your packing shed, where's your cold storage, where do you live? I mean, how all these things relate. And then the systems that you create to organize yourself organize your tools, organize your time, organize your management. All of these things are ways that you can reduce your time and your labor. And so a little softer way of talking about, this harsh reality of like hacking down your expenses and hacking down your labor. It's really not about that in my mind. In my mind, it's about making everything work so that you can enjoy your farm work more and you can enjoy your life better. So this is why this is at the very top. The next thing, and it's related to this, is better yields of marketable produce. Like you just can't increase your yields. It has to be marketable. So you're looking to get not only better yields, but of something you can take into the market. And so the very basis of that, in my personal opinion, is soil health improvement, plus your cultural methods, all the ways that you produce it, plus the systems that you set up to support and reinforce that and make that possible. Better genetics. There's a lot of great varieties that you can grow. Some of them are hybrids and some of them are heirlooms, and you really have to find what genetics are best for you. But you will be really shocked and surprised if you don't already know that there's a great variation in yields and in how much you can get for different crops. I did just this last season, I did some trials of a 300-foot row of a hybrid butternut, and then I did a same 300 row of a delicata, which is kind of more of an heirloom, non-improved variety. Sorry about that. Oh my gosh, I got 33 cases of butternut and I got 9 cases of delicata. So that told me right then and there, like if I'm going to grow like an acre of squash and I'm planning on selling it and trying to make money out of it, I should not grow delicata. Now, delicata can be a great for the market garden. It can be great for yourself. It can be great for like a CSA that could afford it. But literally it's you're getting a third of it. So you'll find that a lot of the heirloom varieties of all the different things that look so super great in the catalogs, and I know this from my Seeds of Change experience, they look great, but in the field, they do not produce. And so you have to be careful. Like if you're going to be doing something at a larger scale, it kind of has to work. Like it doesn't really matter on a smaller scale as much, but when you start to ramp it up to like a half acre, an acre, or like a 10-acre scale, I mean, then you're talking about a 30% increase in yield is a huge difference. And so you really want to seek out the varieties that perform well, but that also meet all of your other needs. So that's, I'm just saying that's a really important thing to look into. Of course, better markets, and that kind of leads to better prices, but it's not just prices, because sometimes it's about volumes and sometimes it's about the duration of the volume. So, you might, like, for example, with the green beans, I was planting green beans every week. I was doing 2 acres every week. And so I had this duration of harvest that I would not have been able to do. I couldn't do 22 acres in 1 week. So I had to do 2 acres each week. So extending out your harvest is another way. And that was a really important market for me to have. So after that, we're looking at crop selections. How do you evaluate which crops are profitable? On a small scale, it's kind of very challenging. And I've got there dropping the dogs, which means, when we finally got to the point where our farm was, we were doing better record keeping, we got the whole farm on QuickBooks, and that was a big deal, and that was painful and sometimes expensive, but we finally did. And then we could really start to see what our sales were, and we calculated that, and we added our farmers markets, and then we could start comparing apples to apples, so to speak. We could compare all of our different crops, and we found out which ones were the more profitable and which ones were the least profitable. And then you have the ones you can't really get away from. I mean, if you're doing a farmers market or a CSA, like, you can't not just show up with some items. You have to. But how much of that, those lower performing varieties, you certainly can change that. So for us, for whatever reason, cucumbers were like, wow, we looked at cucumbers and we're like, we're not going to grow cucumbers, but we did, but we just didn't grow very many. We just grew enough to have at the farm stand. and a few for the CSA, and that was basically it. And we really bumped up the kale because for us, that was the highest profitable crop that we grew. Another way, like if you don't have accurate records for yourself, there is some benchmarking data that universities are starting to do. The University of Wisconsin has some of that, but also there is a benchmarks that Kate Riswall has come up with, and he's done a really, really good job of keeping track of his own operation. And he has about 16 or 18 different crops, and he shows you all the numbers, and you can look them up, and you can just, I mean, it's actually pretty uniformly correct regardless of the growing area. There's going to be regional variations, but relatively that's a similar ranking, right? And then bottom line, all this stuff is just encouraging to keep better records to understand where their money is going, and that's just going to help you overall. Okay, it's time for anybody at all, even has to be Ryan, to ask a question or make a comment or sneeze or something. Anybody? And sometimes it's good to ask a question because other people are thinking about it and you're the guinea pig, and it helps the other people to learn something from your question. So it's not always, it's a good thing.
I'll ask a question.
Okay.
You mentioned record keeping in one of your last bullet points. What is your approach to record keeping? Do you do it like on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, or collect a whole bunch of notes and enter them in at the end of the season and analyzing that? What is your approach on that?
Okay, that's a great
recommendations for
yeah, that's a great question, Heather. Thank you. So so I guess in my mind, there's kind of different types of record keeping, right? So there's financial record keeping, which is just like at the bare minimum, you have to deposit money in the bank, and then you have a bank statement. I mean, that's like the bare minimum. And looking at, but in order to make sense of that, it's good to know where the money came from. So there's financial record keeping, and you may or may not have a record keeping system for tracking your sales, for example, or even tracking your deposits, or tracking your farmers markets receipts, for example. So financial record keeping is one whole area, and that's, you can use paper systems, you can keep spreadsheets, you can go all the way to QuickBooks and have every single deposit, broken out into an invoice if you want. And that's a great way to do it if you can. Another part of your question, though, I think, is how do you do record keeping for farm activities? So production, seeding, harvesting, all those kind of things. And one of the easiest ways that I've learned about is having a lot of clipboards and keeping track of things as best as you can, because it's very challenging and very difficult. One of the things that I want to bring up is a way to kind of tackle that, to understand some of the key activities of what you're doing on your farm. Because no one's going to this isn't a university lab setting where you're going to sit down and you're going to track every minute or every hour of your day, right? Like no one that I know can do that except at a university, a demonstration farm or something. So, but what you do want to do is you want to think about what is important to know. And so, for example, when I was doing the kale, I was kind of always trying to track, how many cases could my crew harvest in a day? And then I would do the math and figure out, oh, okay, I basically my top guy can do 6 cases per hour. So I got to that metric, right? 6 cases per hour was a good harvesting rate. Or if I sent the guys out to harvest for 1 hour, how much value in produce did they come back with? So I started to get, you see what I mean? I'm trying to get metrics or standard units so that I'm not having to keep track of the entire kale harvest over 3 months to know that. I don't have to. There's a quick and dirty way, which is just estimating okay, how much time is this activity taking and how much am I getting back out of it? And that's a relative way of looking at, the labor efficiency or the return for your time. And that's how you can also kind of look at crops, because some crops like flowers, you can pick for an hour and you can walk back with a couple $100 worth of sellable produce, right? And if you go pick watermelons for an hour, you might get a bin and it might be $50. So it all just starts to inform you. So does that answer your question, Heather? There's like there's different types of record keeping, and depends on what you're looking for.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks.
Okay, cool. Any other questions or comments? Or
I am also curious. Maybe you've switched up your market, but you said that you approached the food bank there, and that they had interest in processing green beans, and you're transitioning to organic, or maybe are organic at this point. But was that decision to become organic a philosophical one, or are they offering to pay more money for organic?
Yeah, so for me, because I've found a niche in the organic markets, and that's the markets that could support a smaller scale operation in California. It was both a personal and just kind of a financial decision that that's where the markets were, and that's where I wanted to go. So when I moved back to Indiana, you can't make it on 200 acres as a conventional grain farmer. You can't even make it probably even on, I don't know, 1,000, because you're losing money every acre. But so for me, I wanted to get into specialty crop. I wanted to get into a higher value market. And I had this background and experience of doing organic production. And so those are the markets that I was looking for. I found a price that worked for me. They were happy that it was a transitional. They were more interested in finding local green beans than they were the organic per se. But I was already planning on converting the farm to organics, if that was part of your question, and just looking for the buyer that would support that. And I found that with that contract. Great. Okay, that was a nice little that was good. Good job, you guys. After this, we'll get some other growers hopefully to ask some questions. That'd be great. Okay, so I don't have to tell you, but I will, that farm labor is your highest expense. And so this was a graph that John Hendrickson up at Wisconsin, a guy that I know, and he's done tons of crunching the numbers and about records and production and all this stuff. And they came up with this looking at, I don't know, maybe a dozen farms. And we don't have to get geeky about the numbers, but I just want to point out to you that the labor hours per acre for 3 different farm sizes are instructive. And they have to do with the level of intensity of production, but they also have to do with the level of equipment that you can kind of have on these different scales. And so under 3 acres, you see, it's the highest, it's almost 2,000 hours per acre. And then the 3 to 6 scale is about 1,000, and then 6 to 12 is 700, and then more than 12 is 500. Well, I bet you that most of that is because under 3 acres is mostly hand or smaller scale, and less mechanical weeding and less mechanical tillage, I would guess. And then as you get larger and larger, you have bigger equipment, not only bigger equipment, but just equipment that's kind of dialed in to do everything. So you're doing less by hand. You're basically planting with the tractors, you're cultivating with the tractors, and your labor is primarily a harvest, kind of a big, harvest cost there, but everything else is just done by a few people. I was able, for example, to do my green bean operation because I'm no longer doing the green bean operation, which I'll tell you that story later, with myself. And then I did everything. And then on harvest days, my dad and my uncle ran the forklift, because we had to forklift the pallet boxes off the equipment under the truck. And my dad rode on the picker and picked out frogs and dirt and rocks that got spat out the back of the machine into the green bean picker. And that's what he did. So, it was pretty easy, but I paid 30 grand for that picker. I mean, I never paid that much for a single piece of equipment. And my dad was like, he's an old school farmer, and we're Scottish in origin, and man, Scottish people are tight. So he's like, wow, that's a lot of money. But when I thought about it, my my foreman in California, I paid him 30 grand a year, and he was worth it. I mean, the guy could pick 40 cases of kale in one day. I've never seen anybody like that. And I'd pay him 30 grand a year. There's no way that he could have picked 100,000 pounds of green beans in 1 year, let alone in 8 weeks. So your equipment, if you get the right equipment selections, yeah, the equipment's expensive, but labor and your own labor is way more expensive than you realize. And I think a lot of growers don't count on how much they're spending of their own labor. They don't pay themselves enough because they're not paying themselves at all, but they're not considering how much it's costing them to kind of roll up their sleeves and do the grunt work, when a piece of equipment could do it for you a lot easier, and then frees you up to do other things on your operation or in your life that you need to do. So I just thought that I'd kind of emphasize this, not that that these numbers are, that important to know, or to see, like, well, how many hours per acre am I doing? I don't know, but you know how much you're working, and the idea is to try to find a more efficient production system for the scale that you're at, or maybe even consider a larger scale, and how might that work. So I wanted to share that with you all this morning. Okay, we're going to do some deeper dives before we get into looking at pictures of equipment. These are some intellectual tools, because these are kind of the things that I've learned over the years. And again, there's so much on the internet, and there's so much you can look up and watch YouTube videos. I mean, there's just tons of things. So I want to talk more about the intellectual tools. And this has to do with when you're looking at yourself, and you're looking at your operation, you're looking at your farm, and you're trying to figure out what to do and where to go. Understanding your intention is really critical. And I learned this, and I live by it, and I try to teach it as much as I can, because for me, it was a big thing. You are the captain of your own ship, so steer. And that means to set yourself up for success, and to understand that your actions are the result of your intentions. There's actually scientific basis for this, but also this is kind of a universal understanding of human behavior. When you intend something, you tend to do it. And when you don't intend something, you don't do it. And if you're unclear of your intentions, you are in indecision, or you're kind of waffling, or you're not sure. So if you're not clear, it's usually because your intention is not clear. So the point there is, and it's okay to be in that place, but you just need to know that, oh, I need to clarify my intentions. And then once you get clear, then your actions flow a lot easier. So, and when you grow your operation, you might already feel like you've got a lot on your plate, and you do. And then when you're considering like expanding that, you have to really look at how you're conducting yourself and conducting your business and operating your farm, because maybe for me, it was moving from chaos and overwhelm to clarity. And that was a journey for me. But I realized that I had to make that choice, because reacting to the farm was not me steering the farm, if you can understand. So when you take control and you plan and you make the decision, you get really clear on what it is that you're doing and what you're wanting, then it's a lot easier to do it. Whereas if everything is coming from you left and right, and you feel overwhelmed and everything is chaotic, and you're just reacting to that, putting the fires out, that's kind of how it's going to continue to happen until you decide to stop that. So for me, that was really important. And that's why I think understanding your intention and clarifying your intention is really important, because I think some of the things that happened for me in my farming journey is like, I just kind of knew like I needed to do this thing. And I was really clear. I didn't have any second doubts about it. And I just decided to do it. And when I kind of approach things that way, those are the junctions that worked out the best for me. And when I came to points where I was unclear and unsure, and then I made less well-informed decisions, I found. So I just always try to encourage people to think about understanding your intention and clarifying your intention, so that you really get clear with yourself, and that's easier to move. Okay, the next two are little tools from other industries. So supply chain management. Wow. over my lifetime and my career in agriculture, I've been amazed at how advanced other industries and other businesses are in their intellectual tools. So like if any of you have had jobs, and it doesn't even really matter if it's a larger organization, whether it's a university or maybe it's a corporation or what have you, you actually get training. Like farmers don't get training except for how to do farming stuff, but we don't really get like training on how to figure stuff out or how to manage things or how to manage businesses, but other people do. So I'm kind of hijacking a couple concepts here that I think are really interesting. And I think they'd be helpful. They're helpful to me, and I'm thinking they might be helpful to other farmers. This tool is just the 5 whys, or it's sometimes called root cause analysis. It's kind of geeky, but I like the 5 whys because usually when we have a problem in our life, we jump to conclusions like who did it? Like, why did you do that? Even if it's yourself. So the 5 whys gives you an opportunity to uncover what is the underlying organizational or systemic or design reason that this problem even came to exist in the first place. And that's way different. So I'll beat up on my best friend again. So my best friend, he tells me my superpower is jumping to conclusions. And I just crack up every time he tells me that, because he knows that about himself. But literally, like if I'm farming with him and something breaks, the first thing he does is he blames you. He's like, how come you broke the disc? I'm like, I didn't break it. I was just driving the tractor and it broke. So, if you stay at that level, and I'm just making an extreme example of my poor friend, you never get to the root cause of why the disc broke, right? But this asking 5 whys kind of helps you to get to the very root baseline of why a problem happened. And it's an exercise. So in this particular case, the problem is you ran through a red light. So why? The first why is, well, I was late for work. And like, well, why were you late for work? Because you woke up late. Well, why did you wake up late? Because the alarm clock broke. Well, why did the alarm clock break? Because you didn't check it for work. Why didn't you check it? Because you forgot to do it. So this is kind of a silly example, but what you can find in your farming operation is when you have a problem, instead of just putting the first Band-Aid on and forgetting about it, it helps you to walk through, well, what in my system is not working that even enabled this? And this is what the point of this is, especially for larger organizations that have a lot of people and they can't keep track of everybody. So they have to build systems that work for everyone in a kind of every situation. So you can think about your farm in this way as well. So I find this helpful. So ask the 5 whys and you can get to the bottom of it, hopefully. This is the last one, and I'll stop boring you with my intellectual tools. This is called the weakest link analysis. And it's actually pretty simple, and we all kind of do to some degree. But it's actually a concept, and it's in the lean management toolbox, so to speak, because you can't fix everything. And as a small business person, as an independent farmer, you have limits, and you can't fix everything on your farm. And it can get overwhelming. So what do? Well, you look for the weakest link. You look for the thing that is the most obvious, or maybe it's the thing that's the most painful for you and your operation. And then you fix that first. It's really that simple. Like some people have a problem with getting distracted by too many things. And I can be that way sometimes. But I've learned to just focus on one thing at a time and try to nail that. So here's how that works. You find the weakest link, you fix it. Now you've just removed that weakest link from your analysis. So now you look again and you find out, okay, what's the next weakest link? And then you fix that. So this is a continuous improvement cycle. You don't just fix the first one and then not fix anything. You just keep fixing stuff. So this is just a little tool to help you figure out how to tackle things. Just tackle one thing and then keep doing it. All right, finally, do we have any people on the call? Okay. So now we're going to get to equipment considerations, and I know you're supposed to show pictures and try to help people stay engaged. And I hope that you are still engaged and I'm keeping you engaged. We're going to talk about briefly, because I'm not going to tell you what equipment to get or what's right for you, because I have no idea, but we're just going to kind of talk about some equipment considerations as you think about growing and expanding, or maybe increasing your acreage or what have you. And these are from my perspective, of course, so they're not trying to be all encompassing. And I'm not trying to get super nerdy and telling you like, get the model 5061 of this thing. I'm just going to show you some pictures and we're just going to talk about it. And I hope that it encourages some discussion and some questions. And here's a big list of all the areas, because there's so many areas that we that we buy equipment for, or that we need equipment and tools, and sometimes they overlap a lot. So for me, when I was organizing this talk, I started saying, well, what are the different areas? What are the buckets, you know, that we really need on the farm? And this is the bucket list that came up. Okay, so again, from our friend John Herrickson from Wisconsin, he found that what is the average equipment cost or investment per acre for farms? So they're actually pretty similar. So on vegetable farms, which are, you know, bigger farms, around 7 grand, 8 grand per acre. So if you're looking at a 10-acre farm, you're looking at 70 to 80 grand. That's about what we were. Market gardens are a little bit higher, primarily because they have less land to spread the equipment cost over. They may even have the same basic equipment, but they just don't have as many acres. So that's why it's kind of relatively the same. So this is what people up in Wisconsin anyway spend on farm equipment per acre roughly. And this is like 12 different farms. So these are just averages. You can certainly do lots more and you can certainly do lots less depending on what kind of operation you have. I think these are fairly diversified farms growing probably lots of different crops rather than a simple 1 or 2 crops. So in the bucket of doing fertilization, manure, spreading, compost, and amendments, this is all kind of one category. And how do you do it? You know, you can do it by hand. I've certainly done that on a smaller scale, by hand or with a belly grinder. You get to a little bit larger scale and you're really going to need a 3-point hopper, because you can use this guy for not only broadcast seeding cover crops, you can use it for amendments, you can use it for pelleted fertilizer. I mean, it just comes in really darn handy. Manure spreaders are excellent for spreading compost. You can also add your amendments to the compost and get them spreaded. You basically want to do as much as possible, as fast as possible in the spring or in the fall. You could also custom hire this thing. In California, I had the benefit of having a compost spreading operator really close to me, and he would come in and spread all the compost that I could make, because I had a goat dairy right next to me. So we made 800 yards a year just in static piles, and he would spread it every fall. And he would charge, I don't know, it was like $25 a load to spread. I mean, it was just ridiculously cheap. So that worked out. And now in Indiana, there is another compost spreader, and it is so cheap, I can't afford to buy a manure spreader. I mean, I've done manure spreaders, you know, but you just figure out how to make this part work, because this is a big part, especially if you're doing specialty production. You're probably trying to fine tune your amendments at least. Hopefully you're putting on some compost or something to enliven the soil, and you need to have this function. So figuring that out is helpful. Cover crops. So I've always done a lot of cover cropping in California, also here. There's several ways to get this going. You know, at a small scale, you can easily do by hand and belly grinder several acres of cover crops, but you got to have some way to incorporate it. I've used primarily a rough rototilling and then come back over that with either another drag system or a cultimulcher or a cultipacker or something to give you good seed soil contact. I've also had seed drills. You can see the old International seed drill. Those are certainly floating around the atmosphere for $1,000 or less, but you have to have a seed bed. Part of the beauty of a cover crop establishment is you can kind of rough it in. And especially with vegetable production, you're probably cycling beds over or cycling fields over. And so you might do a quick disc down or a till down or something, kind of some way to get your harvested crop, after you harvest it, get it tilled down and then immediately get a cover crop on it. You don't have time to maybe get a perfect seed bed. So I've found the broadcasting, I do a lot of broadcasting of cover crops just because I find that it'd be easier. It's easier to throw on some more seed and try to find a way to pack it down a little bit and just go for it rather than try to like disc it and till it and get a perfect seed bed and use a seed drill. Of course, it looks nicer, but that's a lot of work when you're moving and grooving. Any questions?
Just one comment.
Yeah.
One of our extension specialists, she did just a little demonstration trial with some cover crops, and she compared the broadcast spreader versus a drilled
Yes.
cover crop seed. And she said, in early establishment, the drill was better, but by the end of the season, or even like, part way into growth, you couldn't tell the difference between the stands. So, the drill costs a lot more. And if you don't have an easy access to one, the broadcast spreader does just as good of a job. So
yeah, the beauty, that makes sense to me. I mean, the beauty of cover crops is that you're not trying to be perfect anyway, because you're just throwing a bunch of seed out, whether you put it in a seed drill or not. You're just trying to get the vegetative growth, and you're not really, you want to get a good stand. Your criteria are, yes, you want to get a good stand, because if you waste your time and don't get a good stand, you've just set yourself back. But I've found it easier just to buy a few more bags of seed and throw down a heavier rate and get it done, because you usually have little short windows and short amount of time, and you're actually trying to do something else while you're doing the cover crop. So the main thing is to get it in. And I found that the quick incorporation of whatever's on the surface and getting the cover crop seed established. And for me, the cultimulcher has been the ticket, because the cultimulcher will press a seed into almost any surface and give you a good germination and a good stand. So that's kind of how I do it. Now, I don't know if you're in your area, if the NRCS or Soil Conservation Service offices have no-till drills for rent, but we do, and that is a possibility, because sometimes a no-till drill can get into almost anything as well. And that could be superior to a rough cover crop broadcast in many cases, and I've done that. So, but I don't know anybody that can afford their own no-till drill at a small scale, because they are expensive and they kind of need to work. But you can rent one for almost nothing from the NRCS office. Okay, let's move on from the cover crop. Primary and secondary tillage, at a small scale, probably most people are doing some sort of combination of rototilling, whether it's a walk behind or a tractor. At a larger scale, I guess you could get by with just a rototiller. But the reason I have primary and secondary tillage here is that I kind of think of your primary tillage is different than your secondary and your finished tillage. So your primary is really kind of opening up a soil. It's about opening it up. And it's also about mixing material. We've got the picture of the John Deere there doing a little chisel plow. And that's just a really small little guy, but that's nice for a vegetable operation, because a lot of times you just need to do, a small area, and you don't have a big tractor to do a 15-foot chisel. and you can just open that up. Rototillers and discs also are more of a secondary, and they do way better if the soil's already opened up and stuff is mixed around. The rototillers, you could force your rototiller to go through where that tractor is going with a chisel plow. I mean, I've seen people do it, but a rototiller absolutely creates a shear pan or a plow pan, because the blades, even if they're coming backwards, but a blade going forward not only cuts, but also presses. And so if you go into a hard kind of field condition, or even if you have a cover crop that's not too loose, you'll just smear a plow pan with your rototiller. It looks great on the surface. It's great for planting, but you've really kind of not done good by your soil texture below it. I have spader. Spader, I've never had a spader. I've had one used. I hired a guy to spade a field, and then I never ever had a guy spade a field again, because it took him like a week and it cost me so much money. I couldn't believe it, but I was paying him by the hour and didn't realize it. And spaders are very slow. They are incredible. They're kind of like a bunch of little dwarves back there digging your garden, but they are very slow. And if that's important to you and it fits at your scale, and you feel like spending the thousands of dollars to buy a spader, by all means do it. I mean, I don't have anything against them. I just personally have not. I've just needed to move faster than a spader can go. And I know that they're hard to come by, they're almost impossible to find used. I've never found a used one, even in California. And these other techniques are good too. So that's kind of what I'm talking about with primary and secondary tillage. You just want to find the horsepower that works for you, so that you can do, I guess this is a good pausing point where we can talk about how whatever your tractor is, whether it's a walk behind or a traditional tractor, is adequately sized so you can do all of your functions with the one tractor. So you can do your primary and secondary tillage, you can do your planting with it because it's got the right row width, you can do your mechanical cultivation because your beds are set up for that tractor, and then your irrigation can then get set up on that. So everything is kind of like a system. All these pieces kind of click and fit together. And that's what's really important, because you don't want to have 3 or 4 different interacting systems and widths and situations where nothing fits. Like you have to jump on this tractor to do this thing, and then you have to change over to do that thing, and then you have to do another thing to harvest, and that becomes a drag, and that means you have to have a lot of equipment laying around that you may not use that much. Seeding, transplanting, Ryan was telling me that a lot of folks down there use the water wheels and also a lot of plastic mulch, and those definitely work. I just kind of wanted to throw out some other pictures and talk about precision seeders, mechanical transplantings, and toolbar planters, because these are all kind of at the next stages of getting a little bit bigger. The precision seeders, there's the Jang is the yellow one down there at the left. Any precision seeders, the Jang is kind of like not quite the entry level, but it's one of the entry levels. And it really will lay seed down the way you need them, so you don't have to come back and thin. And when you're getting in longer beds and longer rows and bigger areas, it's really important to plant correctly, because you can really, if you mess up, it can really cost you. This 2-row transplanters there at the top is kind of what I'm talking about. Something that's more uniform, that's really straight, makes it easy to follow up with your cultivation and your harvesting, just makes everything way, way easier. And then here's a guy on his old farm awl with a toolbar on it. And though I'm not even sure what those planters are, but you can kind of see that he's getting 3 nice, fairly straight rows behind there, so he can do his follow-up cultivation, and everything's fairly uniform. So that's kind of what we're talking about, is that you want to find a system that allows you to plant efficiently, to plant straight, to then set yourself up for success for weeding and cultivating and moving through your fields. And there's a lot of options. There's a lot of different kind of transplanters. There are definitely different seeders. there's certainly really high-end stuff, but you don't have to have really super sophisticated stuff. I mean, you know, these little push planters and these toolbar planters are not that expensive, and they can really, really be helpful to get you set up right. Irrigation systems, you know, there's so many different ways to do irrigation systems. I think, you know, I'm just kind of throwing some generic pictures here of drip tape and some, you know, kind of micro sprinkler heads. I think the main thing I want to emphasize for myself and other growers, because I see this all the time, is we kind of piece together our irrigation systems with what we've got. And sometimes they're pretty ingenious and sometimes they're pretty labor intensive, because, you know, when you start to get a larger and larger system that's more and more chaotic, every aspect of it that you can increase in its efficiency has a big impact. So even though like you may have become accustomed to like walking all the way across the field and opening a valve and then like walking all the way over here, because maybe you like to walk and maybe you're young and, you know, maybe that's cool. But when you start to develop your irrigation system, you kind of want to set it up to think about how can I make this as easy as possible, and not only just the use of it, but the management of it. So that means setting up your subheaders and your headers and your valve systems and anything like that, to where when you turn something on, you can just get it done. And so that's kind of what I want to encourage. I see a lot of vegetable growers that have pieced things together to the point to where it almost takes a full-time person to just make them work and to keep up with them and to repair them. And there's always leaks, but you know, yeah, I think you understand what I mean. And I don't have anything specific to tell you about that, other than it really makes sense to organize your headers and your subheaders and your valves in such a way that you can manage blocks as consistently as possible. And so what's hard about a mixed operation is you've got maybe 30 different crops, and you know, you want to think about, well, maybe I should plant the things that have relatively the same water demands together so I can water all those guys together. So, you know, we would put everything on in like 1 acre blocks, for example. So all the tomatoes were on 1 acre together. They're on 6 foot spacing. And then on that same header, we could have our 6 foot spacing for our squash and our cucumbers and our gourds and our pumpkins and what have you. And so you knew when you opened that valve to that header that went to that block, you knew what you were irrigating, and you could manage it accordingly. Because otherwise you just have one big header and you're trying to irrigate everything, and then you're keeping track because it's intuitively, it makes sense to you because you're the grower and you're walking your crops every day. You know what needs what, hopefully, but it means that you're individualizing your management, and you want to move from individualizing the management of each crop into more of a broad approach where you're managing blocks and fields rather than individual plants, if that makes sense. And I'm going to irrigate right now. Any questions on irrigation? Are people doing mostly T-tape down there, you guys? I see yes. No sprinklers?
Micro sprinklers, but not, 30-foot sprinklers.
Probably, yeah, probably for whatever crops really benefit from overhead, because there's certainly crops that really thrive in that. And yeah, it's pretty hard to beat that. All right, very good. No furrow flood irrigation down there.
More in eastern Arkansas for row crops, but not in northwest Arkansas.
Yeah, okay. All right, we're moving on. How are we doing on time, by the way? We're about an hour in, it looks like. Okay, so.
We're actually, I think we're about an hour and a half in, so.
Oh, okay. So does that mean how much more time do we have?
What did we say, Ryan? Did we say that it ended at 1:30? But so, you know, I expect there might be some people that will jump off here shortly, but you know, we can stay on you know, until you're finished.
Okay, well, I'll try to,
Anything.
it sounds like that I'm pretty close to being at time, so maybe I should put it in high gear. Okay, so remember how we were talking about labor is your highest expense? And weeding and cultivation is probably the area that we could always use the most improvement in. So scaling up leads to a need for more uniform beds and row spacing. And so that's why, so you can get into a mechanical cultivation and weeding system. So transplanting direct seeding is straight. And I'll talk about these two. These are two of my little favorite ones. There's many options. There's many ways to do it. But I think fundamentally what I've learned is that you have to move the soil earlier and more than you think. And the tine system, the one on the right is called the Williams toolbar, and it's the main toolbar system. Oops, it's the main toolbar system that I had. I'm going to back up there. Sorry, I touched it with my mouse. And there's these tines that have like they're sprung steel, so they kind of really force themselves down into the soil. They don't work in every soil. Okay, I know that. They don't work super great in Indiana. But if you have the right soil texture, the tines are really good for picking up pin weeds. And then the toolbars on both the front and the back give you all kinds of options for sweeps, knives, blades, hilling discs, you know, whatever you want to throw on there, because it's a diamond toolbar. And this tool, if there's one tool to get, this is what I got, and this is what I used for a lot of my vegetable crops. And I would recommend it to anyone, but you can certainly just do your own kind of toolbar, fab up, whatever you want. The main thing is you can see behind this one, there is right behind the tractor wheels or guide wheels. So that's a depth. And then right behind the guide depth wheel is a sweep. So you really need to sweep your tractor tires because that's where a lot of your weeds from compaction are going to be going. And also that sets your depth for all the other attachments so that you can get what you need to you can just set things the way you want, and you don't have to worry about up and down. It just sets itself. The other piece of equipment, which are really kind of hard to come by, and I don't know down in your area, Williston cultivators, I think they were used in cotton, possibly, but they are a spider gang that's set at an angle. So when you move them, they're not powered by anything other than just friction itself, because when you put something in an angle and drag it through the soil, it has to turn. And I actually have a 2-row one just like this, and it's fabulous for getting into wetter, heavier soils. You can get into a soil way faster than you can cultivate with a shovel or a blade, and kind of mix it up and have some fun. But the thing that I want to explain is that, you know, you guys maybe already know this, and I apologize for explaining it to the people that already do. You're not really wanting to find yourself having to hoe weeds or cultivate weeds. You want to get them at the germination pin stage, because when they get up and start growing and you have to start weeding them at that stage, you've already waited way too long. I mean, pin weeds, like after your last bed prep at planting time, within about 3 days, you're going to have those pin weeds developing. And the pin weed is where the weed seed is germinating underground, and it's sending an exploratory root that's just kind of free floating in that loose soil. And it's trying to figure out where down is, and then it's going to stick its head up real fast. And you're cultivating and disrupting the soil at that level so that you can eliminate even the emergence of those weeds. So that means going in like almost immediately after planting. And of course you can do stale bed and you can flame prior to seeding some crops, and that's great. But if you're going to do mechanical weeding and mechanical cultivation, you want to get in early and just move that soil, even though you don't wait till you see weeds. And once you see weeds, it's too late. I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to say. And you have to do that too. But if you don't hit it early and hit it often, you kind of have to rethink your weeding strategy. So those are my kind of two little secret weapons that I like. And there's lots of others, including wheel hose and all that kind of stuff, but people know about those. Your biggest labor expense is probably harvest. And again, I'm coming back to this cliche: set yourself up for success, have everything at hand, organize and standardize all of your harvest tools and crates and wagons and whatever you use, and just make it try to get it done fast, because I found that harvesting in larger crews is actually better. I mean, I've had situations where I had to have 3 things harvested, and I'll send like one guy to each and harvest 3 things separately, because like it makes sense, right? You're going to get it all done at once, but it's actually not. There's a synergy when people work together, and it makes the harvest go faster. It's good for morale. It's better for their bodies. And just try to set that up. I have this picture of these guys harvesting chard in here because I want to ask the question, what's wrong with this picture? So kind of like clue, clue, hint, hint, wink, wink. What's you see at the left, and what do you see different on the right?
Where are they going to put their harvested greens on the right?
Yeah.
Facing it?
So again, the truck's not that far away. You're like, well, I'm just going to carry it over there. Well, the thing is, like, okay, multiply that times 1,000,000. And what is that? So, over the course of your farming life, you're going to be doing these activities over and over and over and over again. So the easier you make it, the better off you'll be. It'll be easier for you, first of all. You'll save time. You'll spend less money. You'll have less wear and tear on your bodies and on your equipment. So just set yourself up for success and make it easy. And your job as the farmer, and kind of like the coach, you got to give your team everything that they need. And you don't even want them to ask. You want to give it to them, and you want to say, I want you to do it exactly like this. This is how I want you to do it. And if you set it up right, they'll be happy to do it that way. And if they're not, you've done something really wrong, because most farm workers and most farmers want to do the work in such a way that's more enjoyable and it's easier. Almost everybody's trying to find an easier way to do work. So that's my suggestion for the harvesting. Washing, sorting, packing stations. My gosh, this is a whole nother webinar. There's so many things can factor into this. Again, cliche, set yourself up, think about your flow. Main thing that I see wrong is people don't understand that water flows downhill, and water does not drain if there's no place for it to drain. So make it clean, make it easy to drain. It doesn't have to be, these are fancy pictures. You can get overwhelmed with how many fancy packing sheds there are in the world. But it doesn't, I've seen them in garages. I've seen them, it really doesn't have to be too complicated, but give yourself some time to design and think and explore and talk to people and go see some, and, to either build your own or improve your own, and, make it work for you. Because you do this functional space, you spend a lot of time in there, you want it to be functional, you don't want to be struggling with things. And you notice that most things are up off the ground, and that's all food safety stuff, and that's a whole nother webinar, so I won't really talk too much about that. But when we did our kale, we actually had a lean-to almost out in the field, and all we had was 2 dunk sinks and tables to put clean things on, and that's all we had. And we ran hundreds of thousands of bunches of kale through that. So it doesn't have to be fancy. It just has to work, right? And it has to be clean. So you can figure that out. Cold storage, I was lazy. I didn't even try to do much on cold storage, because for a smaller operation, even up to you know, for us, even we just did cold storage with cold bots. Cold bots are, as you know, some guys created this workaround electronic thing that's tricks. Basically, it just tricks an air conditioner into thinking it's not cold enough, but it also keeps it from freezing. So it's constantly tricking and it's telling it's not cold enough. And then as the condensers start to freeze up, it says, now it's cold enough. And that's all it tells it all day long. So you program it for the temperature you want. And if you have it hooked up right, and it's pretty easy, it actually works as long as you're not trying to cool too big of a space, which all farmers do. However, it will not bring down hot vegetables to a cool temperature very fast. If you have a perishable crop that needs to be brought down quickly, a cold bot will not do it because a poor air conditioner only has so many BTUs. But if you're just doing regular stuff, you can make a cold bot work for you. So that's my recommendation on cold storage. You can build your own. You can insulate a room in a shed, in a barn. You can insulate a trailer. You can buy an insulated box. I mean, you can stick a cold bot anywhere. Delivery distribution. And this is a no-brainer, of course. I just kind of wanted to show you some pictures. You can do it different ways. You know, it's always good to have advertisement on your delivery vehicle if you can, because you always want to be putting your farm name out there. Also, I like this. I picked this one because the guy has a hand truck. He's being smart. He's using tools. It's working smart, not always hard. But you don't have to have a fancy van. I didn't have that fancy of a van at all. The thing I like about having a separate vehicle for your delivery is you can keep it cleaner. And if you have to get GAP certified, which is a whole nother webinar, your delivery vehicle has to have a cleaning log, and you can't be like hauling compost and manure and your dogs and chickens in the back of your pickup truck and then throwing salad mix in there. Okay. If you've done that, and I probably have in the past, maybe, you can't do it anymore. So it's kind of cool. And once you get a real van, oh my gosh, it makes your farm life so much easier than just hauling stuff around in random vehicles. Okay, so we're getting close to the end here. This is from Richard Wiswall, and he's one of my heroes, and he's the one that helped me understand through his book writing and all of his worksheets how to find the profit in your farm. But this is one of the things that kind of struck me when I was, earlier on in my career. So when you're building a farm, you're kind of really hyper focused on building the farm, and sometimes you lose track of why, and sometimes the production leads the farm rather than a farmer leading the production. And I kind of wanted to end the session with talking about this quote. And he says, before I had a clear goal, meaning your intentions, your goals, what's really important to you, I was washing carrots to wash carrots, meaning and purpose were absent. Now I wash carrots knowing that I'm supporting my family, enabling leisure time, planning for my retirement, building community, and living the life I want to live. Carrot washing was put into perspective. So, when the reason why this is important, and I wanted to share it with you all, is that sometimes our personal creative aspect is to just create this beautiful, productive farm, right? And that's great. But there's even a larger purpose, and you have to tap into those larger goals of why it is that you're working so hard so you can sustain it. And you have to be careful of burning out. Everyone has burnout in any career you're in. So you have to really couch all of your activities on this much larger goal so that you really know why you're doing everything, because you really can just gobble yourself up with work. And I just wanted to remind myself and all of you of this larger perspective. And now last, I'll kind of kick this book out. There is a book that's actually called Wholesale Success, A Farmer's Guide to Food Safety, Selling, Post-Harvest Handling, and Packing Produce. It's very excellent. Atina Duffley is the main author, and she's excellent. And I love her presentations and her work. And I find her to be right on. And this book is available, and it talks all about more about wholesale and gets geeky and nerdy about all of that, but also very practical. And we can maybe talk about that at a later workshop or later conversation, hopefully. But I wanted to kind of plug that because I learned a lot from her and a lot from this book, even after doing it. Thank you so much for bearing with me, for looking at your screens for an hour and a half. I can't believe it's been an hour and a half. And I'd love to hear from you. And also, I'm going to be in Arkansas on the 5th, starting November 5th. And I think Ryan's got some farm visits. So I hope to visit some of your farms and bug Ryan if you want to get in touch with me. I'm more than happy to follow up with you. Anybody that's participated in this talk, I'd love to hear from you. And I'm open for you calling me, asking questions, or just talking about your farm. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nathan. Does anybody have any questions for Nathan? We've got a little bit of time here.
They're speechless.
You can unmute yourself, or
you can ask me anything. It doesn't have to be about farming. You can ask me about my hair or anything you want.
Nathan, I am curious. We took a field trip, a few of us on the call, to eastern Arkansas to visit no-till, mostly commodity crops. Or I guess all he was doing at this point was rice and corn, cotton, soybeans, those type of things. And he's had some success growing vegetables, but just didn't have a great market for it. Doesn't sound like. I guess, what is your experience doing any kind of no-till? I know it's probably trickier organically. He was not organic. Have you seen many successful operations like that? And
I haven't. So I personally don't have a lot of experience in the no-till veggie, but what I've seen and what I think would be really cool to try is I've seen Rodale do a no-till roller crimping approach to both doing pumpkin, winter squash, and even potato production. So they'll go into a vetch rye, or maybe even a pure rye, and then they will direct seed through that crimp and go in. And it particularly is great for pumpkins and winter squash because the crop is growing on top of this huge mulch, which keeps the fruit off of direct ground. So you have no dirt splash or dirt or dirty bottom, so to speak, on the pumpkins. So you have no washing of your produce. Your produce is very clean. I just haven't done it because I don't have markets that would I don't grow winter squash or pumpkins, And when I grew potatoes, I was doing dry farming, which dry farming of potatoes, dry farming in general requires the creation of a dust mulch, which caps, it's almost like icing on a cake. The reason you put icing on a cake is, of course, it's tasty, but you actually are preserving the moisture of the cake. That's the functional purpose of icing. So when you do dry farming, you kind of have to till the soil. Like there's really no-till and dry farming aren't exactly compatible. So I just haven't personally done it, but I know that some farmers, the only kind of no-till, and I was actually watching YouTube about this last night, and veggie circles in the smaller scale, it's called no dig. And so that's where farmers are putting a lot of compost into their beds, and they're kind of constantly top dressing compost, and they're never really tilling the underlying soil. And so they're always doing that. But that is a more labor intensive bed by bed. And I've seen operations up to the 5, even 10 acre scales that are doing that. But it's a hand labor intensive production system because they're not using tractors and tillage and mechanical cultivation. They actually claim to have almost no weeds. And they're just running direct seeders or the paper pot transplanters by hand to get the production, but they don't have any other sort of mechanization other than what a market gardener would have. And I think those are fascinating systems. I know a guy in Sonoma County that was one of my buddies and competitors, and he went that route. And 10 years later, he's doing fabulous. He really has grown his farm and he's doing really well, but he's at the same scale that he's at. I think he's at maybe definitely under a 5-acre scale. He might be 2 to 3 acres, and everything's done by hand, and he has a pretty good sized labor crew, but he's making it work and he loves it. And so I know that that's possible. But in terms of like a larger, like no-till soybeans and no-till corn, like you see in the commodity crops, I don't know anybody that's doing large scale no-till, mechanical no-till in the veggie world per se.
Just know, this past spring, at least May, I think we were 10 inches above average as far as rainfall goes. It was just a difficult time for people to get out in the field. There was a lot of flooding incidents as well, because a lot of our farmland would be close to a river. And so, just as we prepare to become more resilient, what does that equipment look like? And, can any of it be, used as we transition to maybe lower amounts of tillage? That sort of thing. People like a raised bed, certainly for the warming effects, and also just for the resiliency, as if we get 10 inches of rain over the course of 3 days.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, ironically, I'm a tillage guy, so I only know tillage solutions. So, for example, I'm glad you mentioned the bed shaper, because I didn't throw that in this talk. But bed shapers and hilling soil and throwing soil has advantages and disadvantages. But one of the advantages in the spring is it gets you a drier bed, or it gives you a slightly drier bed during crucial growing phases. So one of the things that I've seen growers do prior to the winter, because they know they're going to have a wet spring, is they'll leave their fields rough, or they'll actually do like a chiseling, which will leave ridges in the field. And so you have a lot more surface area when you have a ridge, like a mountaintop and a valley, mountaintop and valley. And that'll dry out faster in the spring. Also, some veggie growers out here in California, they pre-shape their beds in the fall and let them overwinter. And then in the spring, the pre-shaped beds are kind of sitting there and they dry out faster too. So those are all kind of some considerations. I think, building organic matter and compost levels in the soil also makes soils breathe better. So that's part of resiliency that can be helpful. I think the cover cropping is kind of a mixed bag with that, because sometimes cover cropping can help drink out moisture because you've got more evapotranspiration happening through the canopy. But then also you can kind of shade the soil and have cooler soils as a result. So sometimes it just depends on what you're doing. But rye can really pump a lot of moisture out of soil, but it does so at the expense of having a tremendous amount of biomass to deal with. So you've got one solution, but you've just created another problem. What are you going to do with 5 tons of rye straw per acre? So those are some things that I think about.
I didn't see a lot of plastic in any of your photos. Did you use it? I mean, I know California is just tremendously different.
Yeah, I didn't use plastic primarily because I was doing a lot of direct transplanting in California. The reason California is different is it does not rain after a certain date. So it's a Mediterranean climate. So after it doesn't even rain really in the spring, except maybe once or twice. So you have almost no weed germination after you start tilling ground, after the initial moisture leaves. And so what that means is it's so much easier to control weeds out here than it is in a temperate climate where it rains every week or every other week. So it's just a radically different picture than the Midwest or where you guys are at. And that's why plastic culture out here is just not that big, except for crops like strawberries and things that really you get a big bang out of it. But because of the dry soil, you're only wetting the T-tape line, and we would mostly actually throw soil and cover soil and do like mini hilling or even aggressive hilling on crops. You just we didn't have problems with weeds out here, not like you do in a rain-fed growing area. So I understand that plastic culture is, very necessary in many parts of the country to have economic production.
All right, that's great. Is there any other questions for Nathan? Well, I wanted to let everybody know that we do have a couple of other upcoming webinars this fall. We've got one coming up in a couple months. It's a farm management webinar using the Tend software and real-time data collection. That's with some local folks, a couple of farmers, Adam and Melissa Millsap, and then Jonathan MacArthur, who is part of our program. And then similar to Nathan, we had Ellen Polishek scheduled to come, and because she, because of COVID, she's not traveling. So we're going to do a few webinars with her, and they're, all related to farm management as well. The first one is on crop costing. The second one, investing in growth. And then the third one is discussing market channels, wholesale and direct to consumer. And so I hope you come back and join us for those webinars. And you can find information on that, and registration is open for the one coming up on November 18th. Just look at our Facebook page, CAF UA. Is the call name for that. And so you can find more information there. And if there's no other questions, I think we'll say goodbye for today. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.